In this video, we're going to be going over 5 big mistakes that every single DPS player makes that prevents them from climbing. And these mistakes are even mistakes that I myself make. But if we can acknowledge these mistakes and work on completely eliminating them from our gameplay, we 100% will climb. Now we're going to break it all down, but special thanks to the sponsor of this video, GameLeap. GameLeap is the #1 educational platform online, having tons of in-depth guides from top-level players and coaches alike, and I partnered with GameLeap to make a 10-video course, so if you want access to all of that to get better and to support the channel, go check it out in the description down below. Now, the first big mistake, and this one can be a bit tedious, but it's ever so important, and it's making sure that you're fully mechanically warmed up before you hop right into a comp game. Now, I understand that you want to just jump right into a game right away, but I know for a fact that you've often felt that maybe your aim was off, you weren't hitting shots that you normally would hit, and most of the time it comes down to not fully warming up. You don't want to spend the first 3 to 5 games at the start of every single comp session playing much worse than you normally would play, because that's going to greatly affect your win rate. And let's say you play 10 games in a day, but 3 to 5 of those are games where you're not playing at your absolute peak or even at like a base level, then your win rate is going to be really poor, even if you're playing really well or you're a good player. So this is really important. But the next question people ask me is, how do I warm up? And there seems to be an overemphasis in doing things like aim labs and Kovacs. And while I do think that those programs can be a bit useful depending on how new you are at FPS in general, at the end of the day, these are products trying to be sold to you as a catch-all for your aim, when the reality is they're not really going to improve your aim in Overwatch all that much past a certain point. You're not replicating the actual movement of characters inside the game, whether that's the opponent's movement or your own movement. You're not actually replicating the weapons and the types of fire, the delay, whether it's a projectile, or the difficulty of the hit scan fire, and you're never under pressure. So you need to practice inside the game for warm-up and to improve your mechanical skill in order to get the best improvement and warm-up with your set time. So here's what I would suggest. Practice a little bit using Vaxta VXTA. This is going to allow you to practice your own aim against isolated targets, but they are moving around and they are actual hitboxes, so that's going to help you a bit. Then I want you to hop over in something like Tryhard Free-For-All, where you get to practice the pressure scenarios of trying to fight opponents that are actively trying to kill you, and aiming under pressure is a completely different skill than aiming in isolation. This is very, very important because in Overwatch, you're constantly under pressure, and trying to hit a headshot on a target that's going to kill you if you miss versus hitting a headshot on a target that is just moving around, or in a freaking aim labs where they're not even characters, that's never going to replicate the pressure, and that's super important. And then the last thing is, I want you to do a specific hero practice. You could do something like pulse bomb training, hypothetically. Even on tanks, you could do something like Winston juggling, set up a custom game where you can practice your primal rages. You could practice dragon blades. You could practice mid-air mind combos. There's a million different things you could practice, but it's only about specifically practicing something mechanical on your hero that you wouldn't get in the other modes as much. Now, the next big mistake, and this is one that I personally do way too freaking much. It's a huge, huge problem, and it's being overly flexible. Now, you got to understand that being flexible is good, right? Being flexible, being able to play every single character to an extent can be useful, because then you can always play what is the quote-unquote right character for that situation, right? Whatever character is best to fit whatever problems you're having. Like a character that can help burst down on the front line, create a lot of pressure with space, like Junkrat. Or maybe it's a character that could deal with the Pharah or a flying character, so a hit scan. Being flexible is good because you can fill in these problems, but there are several problems with being too flexible. The first one is you're not mechanically improving at any of them that much. You're spreading your playtime really thin, and instead of getting the reps in the characters that you're trying to really improve at and really get good at, you're really improving very slightly all over the place. Like, imagine a Widowmaker player that plays a ton of Sim and Torb and Genji and Pharah and plays them all about equally. You're not getting as many reps mechanically, and just overall, you're not improving at that character as much because you're splitting your playtime far too thin. Now, that being said, the biggest problem with being overly flexible is oftentimes flexible players will switch off the second they meet any in-game opposition. And there are a lot of mid-game quote-unquote trials that you have to learn to play through. In fact, these are litmus tests in order to climb. Like, as an example, let's say that back to you being a Widowmaker main, right? But every single time you get diffed by the enemy Widow, so if you ever get sniped, or every single time you get dove, you just swap off of Widow. Now, in your mind, you might be thinking, I'm a flexible player. Every time this happens, I can just swap off of this character. But Widow is your best character by far, and the character you want to climb with. And every single time you meet a little bit of opposition, you're just swapping off of your character, which means that forever, whenever enemies just counter swap you or play something that is a little bit more difficult to play against on average, you're just gonna swap. And that's the problem, is eventually that doesn't work anymore. Eventually, you have to learn how to play your character up against a certain amount of counters and a certain amount of opposition in order to succeed. And I'm not telling you to never swap. Like, if you're getting super hard countered by many members of the enemy team, then it probably would be easier for you to swap. But you have to make it so that it's not easy for a single person, or maybe even two people, to just completely shut you down and force you off your character. They have to work for that swap off. They should have to literally all swap. All of them need to focus you. All of them need to play something that shuts you off your main. Because if you're gonna go and play a character you're not as good at, they need to deserve it. And if it's just someone that's just like, oh, I'm just gonna randomly play Winston to shut you down, and you swap every single time, are they really working that hard to get you off your main? And are you giving them that value, the value of making you swap, for too little because you're not confident in your character? You're never playing your character through any of these hard mid-game trials, and the vast majority of the time you're basically giving up or submitting to whatever the opponent is trying to do, and that is just not gonna work if you want to get better and you want to climb. Some amount of scenarios are going to be at a slight disadvantage, some amount of scenarios are going to have added pressure, and you still got to learn how to succeed in spite of those things. Now, the third big mistake that every DPS player runs into, especially in Overwatch 2, is ignoring the tank. But when should they ignore the tank? Or should you? The general presumption is that you should really ignore the tank a lot, but there actually are times that you can focus the tank. So how do you make the distinction between focusing the tank or just completely ignoring him and going for some alternate play on the enemy backline? Now, here's the thing you need to understand. If a tank is being double pocketed or being actually actively healed by one or two people, then you can't kill that tank. The tank is going to be very, very difficult to kill because they have all this damage mitigation, huge health totals, and they have so much freaking healing. Now, that being said, there are some exceptions. Certain heroes can burst really, really high amounts of healing by just doing a crazy amount of damage. Think Reaper or Junkrat or maybe Echo's Beam. These things do a crazy amount of damage, and if there's an opportunity, sure, you could still kill a tank even if they're getting healed. Probably not double pocketed, but maybe if they're being solo pocketed and a little bit out of position. The second scenario is if they're completely isolated or their supports are split off from them. So if you have a Winston that jumps the supports and bubbles off the supports, then for that time period, if you're not a DPS that is capable of going and helping the Winston because he's too far away, it might be best for you to actually target that tank because that tank is true isolated. The tank might even turn around from the front line, going to go peel for his supports, but you're going to be able to kill that tank because the tank doesn't have the resources they need to stay alive. That's a situation that you have to really look out for. It's going to be up to you because if you're like a Cassidy and your Winston is like isolating the supports really far away, what can you do? You don't really want to spend your time just chasing those supports or trying to catch up to your Winston, and then isolated tank can be great. And also, when I talk about isolation, if a tank actually rotates a corner or they're pushing too aggressively outside of the LOS or effective range of their supports, that could be a situation where maybe you're not going to be able to kill that tank, but putting pressure in them is going to force them to back way off and stop playing super aggressive to the point where they're getting additional value because they're not being punished. Last up is in situations where there is CC, anti-healing, or damage alteration like Discord. First off, with a form of CC, typically by your tank player, if you have that set up and primed, being a damage dealer that can damage the enemy tank and then your tank can capitalize on that damage with the CC can be fantastic. Think of it like your Doomfist is up against the enemy Hog and you're damaging the Hog so that he uses Breather in front of your Doom and your Doom can cancel it. You have to take note and see when your tank is trying to do that or communicate with them. It's not really worth shooting the enemy tank if that's not going to happen. especially if both of your tanks are just brawling around and there's no coordination, but it is something to look out for. Now, as far as anti-healing, that's an obvious one because it's basically like in that window of time, the tank is in a vulnerable position, but you have to actually evaluate whether or not it's worthwhile for you to focus that tank. How likely is it that they're going to die or get punished? And then Discord's a big one because tanks oftentimes with Discord on them can just die. They can just straight up die even through healing if you get consistent headshots in them. This goes double for characters that have huge head hitboxes like Orisa. They think they're invincible, and a Discord and a couple of headshots later and they're just dead out of nowhere. Now, the fourth big mistake that DPS players make, and this is another one that I make all the freaking time, it's forcing peel is not enough to carry. This is most common with dive characters or characters that take off angles or characters like Tracer. If you get peel, so let's say you go on a target and you get another support to come bail them out, or you get a DPS to come bail them out, or even a tank, you get people to come towards the person that you're trying to kill, and they all bail out that person. While that is good, and in a coordinated play, oftentimes the players that come back and peel for you are giving up space that in a scrim or a coordinated setting, your teammates would fill that space. But what's the reality of ranked? Will your teammates always fill the space that the opponents are giving up? No, they 100% will not. And most of the time, you are going to be stalling for time, stalling for attention, but you're running out of resources, you're dwindling down in life total, and oftentimes what's going to happen is you're going to die, and then you're not going to be there to follow up on what your teammate is doing. Distracting, creating pressure, and getting peel is just not enough to carry. Oftentimes, if you have a duo or a trio that is coordinating with you and applying pressure simultaneous to you, sure, it could be fantastic. But in a ranked environment, especially a solo queue environment, it's just not going to be enough, and you can go in game after game thinking that you're doing a lot, but you're not really doing enough to carry. Oftentimes, the best thing to do is to create pick opportunities for yourself, and you can do that with your positioning and your timing. So as an example, you can soft engage first to bait out key cooldowns like Suzu or Nade, and try to soft engage in a way that puts you in a safe position after you're engaged, so that you can wait for your cooldowns to come back and re-engage before the opponents get theirs back. Or you can set up the proper timing. So instead of being the one that goes in first, tries to bait the enemy attention, and you hope and pray that your teammates are the ones that take the space that is given up and follow up on what you're doing, you get in a great position with all your cooldowns and you wait for your team to engage. And once your team starts to engage, once your team starts to push in and try to fight for space, you use the response from the enemy team to your team for you to go and be the one that creates the play. So you're guaranteeing that you're the follow-up. You're guaranteeing that you're the one getting picks, and you're relying more on yourself rather than putting all the basically action or the necessary action on your teammates when you have no idea what they're going to do or how they're going to play. Now, this one is one that's the most abstract one because it's going to change directly depending on the teammates you have, how much communication you have in your lobby, but it is one of the most important things to nail down if you want to make sure that you have impact in every single game and not just the games where your coordination with your team is just magically on point. Now, last but certainly not least, this is another one that I do pretty poorly, and I think a lot of DPS players do poorly. It's assuming that follow-up will always come. So let's say you go in and you get a pick, or you go in and get some initial advantage. Most of the time, DPS players will think, hey, we got an initial advantage, we got a pick, let's go in for more. But if your team isn't on the same page as you, that initial pick you got and that push-up could turn into over-aggression, isolation, and death. And now that pick that you got traded out, and you're back in a 4v4. And in your mind, you're like, hey, I got a pick, I created all this space, I created this advantage, why isn't my team pushing up with me to close out this fight? And most of the time, it's because they're on a completely different page than you. The supports are off doing their own thing. Maybe they were being dove, maybe they're trying to live, maybe they're trying to keep the tank up. Maybe your tank is playing a lot more passive, doesn't want to risk getting picked off, or maybe they just aren't playing correctly. The thing that you need to understand is just because a play could be proper on paper doesn't mean that you could just try and go for it every single game. Like, perhaps the right play is to play really aggressive as a team, push up, get staggers, but because of people doing this incorrectly so much, your tank just doesn't want to risk it. And if you go by yourself, you could end up being the feeder. Basically, it's only the right play if your team actually follow up on it. And it probably is the play they should have made, but that doesn't mean that you can make it, even if it's the right play, if your teammates are not following through with it. This is so important. At the end of the day, as a DPS, you are not the protagonist, and you are not the leader. You are not the team lead. You are just one player with 4 other players that all have their own opinions about what they should do, and they all have their own problems, and unless you think about what they're doing, oftentimes many of your plays are going to be washed away with mistakes that could have been simply avoided if you would have just opened your eyes a little bit and turned around, noticed what your team was doing, and tried to play off them a little bit more. You see how this tip goes hand in hand with the 4th tip, and it's a super important idea. Basically, we're trying to split you from thinking about a DPS player being alone. Every single action you take should really be with the thought of what your teammates are doing, what value they're contributing, what pressure they're contributing. And they will always do that. They will always create those things. No matter how bad they are, you could still utilize what they're doing and play in a way that allows them to contribute to your plays. Really, really important stuff. But if you have any questions about those concepts, you got to let me know down below. Make sure you follow my stream, smash that subscribe, and go check out the second channel. The links will be in the description down below. And I'll see you next time.